Hello, and thank you for being here today to listen to our webinar about the impact of screen use on adolescent wellbeing. My name's Kate Maston, and I'm a Senior Program Manager at the Black Dog Institute, which is located in Sydney on Gadigal and Bidjigal land. So I work on the Future Proofing study, which is currently the most comprehensive longitudinal study of adolescent mental health in Australia, and I'll be taking you through some of our latest findings in this webinar. So before we put together this webinar, we asked parents to tell us what concerned them most about their children's screen use. And when we consolidated these responses, we found three main themes of concern emerging from parents. And these were around the amount of time that their kids are spending on screens, their children's safety online, for example, exposure to strangers, predators, and bullying, and the content that their children are exposed to online. And particularly this is around age-inappropriate content or potentially harmful content like extremist ideas or unrealistic beauty standards. And before I go on, I really do want to emphasise how uncharted this territory is for parents. We grew up in a world that looked very different to the world that teens are living in today. I have two young teenagers myself, and I know that parents really are just trying to do the best that they can. Because it's not just childhood that's changed, parenting's also changed. And the feedback that we're hearing from many parents is that they feel at a loss about what to do and how best to approach technology use in their homes. So to address this, the webinar today has two aims. First, I'll talk you through what we're learning about screen use and mental health from our own research here at the Black Dog Institute, which is involving many thousands of adolescents. And then towards the end of the webinar, I will share some options that might be helpful for parents and carers to think about when navigating the digital world with their kids. So we know that young people today are the most connected age group of all time. 99% have a personal screen-based device and 50% have 5 or more devices. And they just can't conceive of a time before the smartphone and the online world. And for adolescents, this is all happening at a stage in their development where their social connections are really central to their identity formation. Risk-taking is at its peak, and mental health problems like depression and anxiety typically first begin to emerge. And you might find this interesting. So a study conducted by the Harvard School of Public Health showed that across 6 popular social media apps, ads aimed at children and teenagers brought in almost 11 billion US dollars in a single year. So it's really no surprise that the algorithms on these apps are designed to predict our kids' interests, keep them engaged, and keep them using these products for as long as possible. So naturally, there are a lot of questions about whether the rise in screen use is helpful or harmful to adolescent wellbeing. And before I go on to present our findings, I will tell you briefly about where this data comes from. So the Future Proofing study has been running at the Black Dog Institute since 2019, and it involves thousands of the same adolescents completing annual confidential online surveys for 6 years, starting from when they're in year 8. And along the way, teams of academics are analysing this data, and our findings are regularly shared with key decision makers and stakeholders, hence this webinar with us reporting our findings back to you. So today's findings are from over 3,700 Australian students in years 10 to 12 who completed these surveys last year. Now, these are some of their characteristics. I'll just leave that up on the screen for a moment. All right, so to begin with, let's look at what adolescents told us about how they're using screens. So the adolescents in our study reported that they're most commonly using screens for streaming video content like YouTube or Netflix, engaging with social media and searching the internet. Less common was gaming. Around 2/3 of adolescents reported regularly gaming and then creating their own content. So we had about a quarter of adolescents who said they were creating their own content, and this might include things like coding or recording and sharing videos. We also learned from our participants that on average, young people are spending about 3 to 4 hours a day on screens. This is outside of schoolwork, and 2 to 3 hours of that is spent on social media. Now, as you can see, Instagram is the most popular app in this age group, with 79% of students reporting that they were using it at least weekly, and this is followed by Snapchat and then TikTok. However, as you can see on this graph, adolescents spend significantly more time each day on TikTok, so an average of 2.5 hours, compared to 1.5 hours a day on Snapchat and an hour or less on Instagram. And we know that TikTok is particularly engaging because of its seemingly endless stream of short videos that feature things like music and dances and challenges and memes and so on. And this really does appeal to adolescents' particular focus on social connection. So next we asked detailed questions about how young people are using social media, and we learned that 82% of adolescents mostly use social media to communicate with their real-life peers. And this really fits with what many teenagers are saying, which is that they no longer distinguish between online and offline relationships. They all exist as part of the same continuum. We had 70% who told us that they were regularly scrolling or viewing other people's content. And then far fewer adolescents reported that they communicate with people that they've met online or that they share content publicly. But is there an association between screen use and mental health? So first I'm going to talk you through some of our findings, and then I'm going to discuss what we and other researchers think that it might mean. So what we do know from the future proofing study and from other research is that there is an association between daily screen hours and mental health. So as you can see on this graph, our data shows that as the hours of screen time increase, there is an increase in the percentage of adolescents experiencing symptoms of depression. So specifically, it shows that 22% of the adolescents in our study who used screens for 5 or more hours a day met criteria for depression. And the patterns for anxiety and psychological stress look very similar. We also looked at whether different ways of using screens was associated in different ways with mental health. So firstly, we analysed the relationship between the amount of time spent per day on the top 3 social media apps and a range of different mental health symptom measures. So we did find that higher daily hours on TikTok was significantly associated with greater depression, anxiety, insomnia, and disordered eating. Higher hours on Instagram was associated with greater depression and anxiety. However, we found that higher hours on Snapchat was not significantly associated with any of the mental health symptoms that we examined. And we think that the reason for this is because Snapchat is predominantly a messaging app for teens to stay in touch with their friends, compared to TikTok and Instagram, which expose us to a much wider world of curated and often idealized content. And in many cases, or in some cases, this content can be distressing or age inappropriate as well. And as we also saw just before, teens are spending much longer amounts of time on TikTok, which could be another explanation for why we're seeing stronger links with mental health symptoms. So related to that last slide, we also found that using social media actively, so that's mostly to communicate with people or friends that you know in real life, was actually associated with lower levels of depression and anxiety. And this is really good news, and it echoes what other research is showing, which is that online interactions with genuine friends can enhance mental well-being by improving those connections. However, on the flip side, we did find that using social media mostly to scroll or to view other people's content was linked to higher levels of depression and anxiety. And what about gaming? So we know that many kids enjoy gaming, and encouragingly, most research to date has found little evidence of a link between gaming and mental health, because video game players are not usually socially isolated. They play with friends, which has a lot of benefits. So what did we find? So our study found that higher daily hours spent gaming was not associated with elevated anxiety, insomnia, or disordered eating. However, we did find an association with higher gaming hours and depression, which was really only driven by those adolescents who reported gaming 6 or more hours per day. So we found about a quarter of those who were gaming over 6 hours a day met criteria for depression. And like everything, there's got to be a sweet spot with gaming. We know it provides benefits for most people, but once people are playing for many hours, and especially late into the night where it can start having an effect on sleep and functioning the next day, then this can cause issues. So what does all of this mean for the question of whether the rise in screen use is helpful or harmful to adolescent well-being? Well, the answer is it's complicated, and I'll tell you the reasons why. So it's complicated because what you're doing online really seems to matter. People can be using screens in so many different ways. Like we just saw in our study, texting and gaming with friends was not really associated with worse mental health. But spending long amounts of time just scrolling, especially on TikTok, does seem to be linked to poorer mental health. And this makes it really difficult to make blanket statements about screens being harmful for mental health, because we know that screens can also offer many benefits, particularly when it comes to social connectivity, which is really important for well-being. It's also complicated because when we measure screen use and mental health at the same point in time, like the data I've just shown you, there is clearly an association. However, what we don't know is which direction this association goes in. You see, it might not be the case that spending longer using screens is creating mental health problems. It could be that when someone's experiencing mental health problems, then they're more likely to be using screens for longer periods of time. And what the research is starting to show is that the link between screens and mental health is more likely to be bidirectional. So if you think of it like this, if a teenager is feeling down or stressed, they might spend more time online to distract themselves. But the more time they spend online, the more likely they are to encounter things that could make them feel even worse. And so it can become a cycle where their mood affects their screen time and their screen time affects their mood. And what about the long-term effects? Well, interestingly, the research that's been done looking at the long-term effects of screen use on teenage well-being hasn't been able to provide conclusive evidence that screen use is actually causing mental health problems. So this really is an area that needs more research in order to better understand what's going on. And there are many people who are working on this, including our team at the Black Dog Institute. So what do we know? All right. So we do know that screens may act like an amplifier for existing issues, particularly for children with additional needs or mental health challenges. So it makes sense that who you are and what you're going through when you go onto a screen is going to make a difference to how your screen use affects you. So if you know that your child is struggling, then it is probably a good idea to keep a close eye on their screen use and the type of content that they're engaging with. We also know that online and offline risks may mirror each other. So, for example, a child who is being bullied at school is at higher risk for being bullied online. We know that age and gender also matters. So younger children aren't going to have the maturity and impulse control to regulate their screen use. And research is starting to show that girls seem to be most susceptible to the well-being effects of social media when they're aged between 11 and 13, whereas for boys, it's when they're 14 to 15. And some of the other factors that may increase risk for online harm include being socially isolated, or already having struggled with mental health symptoms, or being neurodivergent. So all of these may introduce additional complications into your child's experiences with technology. So let's unpack that a bit. To give you some examples of the ways that screen use might exacerbate mental health symptoms, research shows that there are several important factors. And the first one is upward social comparisons. So this is where we compare ourselves to others who we see as superior or more successful than us in some way. It might be related to body image or lifestyle or something else. And anyone who's ever been on social media will have experienced this. And we know that this can be highly problematic for teens who are struggling with well-being issues, and also for younger teens who are not yet able to critically analyse the content that they see online. So secondly, exposure to age-inappropriate or explicit content, and this includes sexual content, can be problematic. And sadly, we do know that algorithms on social media apps have been shown to increase exposure to psychologically harmful content to susceptible individuals. And this is mostly related to disordered eating and self-harm, which then can further exacerbate these issues in those young people who are already at risk. And finally, the amount of time spent on screens, which incidentally was the top concern of parents, is important because of the way that it can displace other healthy and important activities. So what's it displacing? Well, when we asked young people in our study, their top 3 responses were schoolwork, chores, and sleeping. And none of these are particularly exciting activities for most teenagers, but they are obviously all very important and probably the most likely to generate some degree of conflict at home as well. From a mental health perspective, the impact of screens on sleep is of particular concern because we do know that insufficient sleep increases the risk of mental health problems for adolescents. However, I really do want to pause and emphasise that researchers have also found for many young people, screen use can positively support mental health. And one of the first ways I'm going to talk about is online peer connections. So screen use is often shown to increase social connectivity and relationships amongst teens. And if a teenager is having a difficult time, they may have trouble engaging with friends face-to-face and instead prefer interacting online. So as one student told us in a focus group, I find it really hard to connect with kids at school because I don't have a lot in common with them, but I have an awesome group of online friends who I game with, and that's one of the happiest parts of my day. Next is emotion regulation. So many young people report using screen-based activities to help regulate their emotions as a coping mechanism, to switch off or distract themselves from negative thoughts or feelings. And this means of digital emotion regulation can be beneficial for many people. And perhaps you've used it yourself to unwind from a stressful day. So as one student put it really clearly, it's exhausting being in my brain. Sometimes I just like being by myself and scrolling for a bit. It helps me to relax. And we know that neurodivergent teens especially report the benefits of using screens for emotion regulation. And finally, as we all know, the internet does offer excellent opportunities to learn and connect and find support. And this is particularly true for marginalised groups of young people, where the online space is somewhere that they can be themselves and find safe communities to connect with. And there's also a wealth of really informative content available online that many young people are leveraging to educate themselves and to develop their skills. So what can families do to support their children to navigate the digital world? Well, the good news is positive relationships with parents and families have been shown to be significant protective factors for teen mental health, and this includes when engaging online. So I'm going to spend a minute or two running through some of the options that might be useful for families to have a think about. So starting with the basics, and many parents are already doing this, but it's really up to us as parents to help mitigate the potential impacts of screen time. So thinking about what we can be doing to ensure a balance when it comes to engagement in other activities, things like ensuring regular access to offline social engagements and particularly physical activity. So there is good evidence now linking higher daily screen hours with childhood obesity, but also prioritising 8 to 10 hours of quality sleep for your teen. Given the clear association between sleep and good mental health, and this does mean, where possible, removing digital devices from the bedroom. Next, as parents, we have a wonderful opportunity to educate our kids about the online world from a young age. And this includes safety and risks, of course, which most parents are already doing, but also about the intentional design of social media apps, about how they're designed to keep us using them for as long as possible, because these companies make a lot of money from our time and attention. And also about the role of algorithms in shaping the content that we see, which often means shaping our viewpoints about all sorts of topics. Related to this is teaching our kids how to critically analyse the sources of their information, particularly if it comes from social media, and if appropriate, having discussions about alternative perspectives about divisive issues. And then finally, with sensitive topics like pornography or extremist material or body image, kids are going to be less likely to come to their parents with these issues, and it's often going to be up to us as parents to proactively raise these topics so that in the future, if and when they do encounter this content, they're better informed and they may feel more comfortable coming to us and talking about their experiences. Finally, I just want to say that this is really challenging. There's no guidebook, and we know that banning technology from teenagers doesn't work. These devices are here to stay. They're a part of our life. So perhaps maybe see if you can find a middle ground and throw away the parent guilt. And to do this, it might help to consider a shift in our role from monitoring to mentoring. So this still includes setting boundaries and limits, of course. And if you had to choose 2 times of the day to go tech-free, consider bedtime and meal times as the most important for well-being. So as I said earlier, insufficient or poor quality sleep is a known risk factor for depression, and tech-free meal times will provide a whole lot of benefits for family connection and communication. But it's also important to have a look at the positives in your child's online interests. So try to engage and get to know these platforms. Think about how you might be able to work together as a family to make changes if you feel that you need to do that. So get your young person to reflect. What's healthy for me? How am I feeling when using these devices? So that they can also be an active participant in these conversations. And if you can, try to connect with your kids online. They really want to invite us into their worlds, especially younger children. And you might already be playing video games with them or sharing memes or exploring content together. And these are all really great. But even if they don't want that, you can still check in with them every day to see how things are going in their virtual life, just as you'd ask them about their day at school. So for more specific advice about screen use in children, the eSafety Commission is an Australian government agency that offers really excellent support and a huge amount of information for parents. And one feature which could be especially useful is the eSafety Guide, which I've just pictured a screenshot of that up on the slide. And this provides information for parents about the features and potential risks associated with the most popular social media, gaming and other apps that are available to Australian children. And one really good thing about this site is that it's regularly updated, so it keeps up to date with the changing apps and games. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening today, and a very big shout out to the students, school staff and families who've been contributing every year to the future-proofing research. We'd really love to receive your questions and hear your feedback. So if you do have a minute, please visit our feedback form to share your thoughts. You can use the QR code or the link on the screen. Thank you so much for your time.